you very much for coming. And this morning, it's a very good chance for you to know one of our very senior docents who started participating in the program since the first batch. And now he's very professional in many aspects. You can introduce yourself later in what kind of aspects you're professional at. And I think a very important part of our guided tour is that we focus on international visitors. But sometimes if you're Taiwanese people and you're giving introduction to international people, you don't really know if they can understand you because they have less background knowledge and they don't really know the terms that local people use. So there are just some subtle details that we haven't really learned, but now it's, well, fortunately in our program we have recruited a lot of international people in to work with us on this content. And today, Teacher Iago is going to share with you from his perspective, there are just some tips for you to sharpen your guided tour and make it more efficient in communicating with international visitors.
Hi. Phaedra, wait, do you want to do the video first, or should I introduce myself to the video? No?
You can introduce.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Iago, and my Chinese name is Yake. I feel most of you are Taiwanese here, is it true? Who is Taiwanese? Could you raise your hand? Taiwanese. Mostly Taiwanese. I think the talk that I'm going to give today will be helpful to you because sometimes we're so used to knowing stuff about our own culture that we forget not everybody has the same background knowledge as us. And some things that I've noticed while giving tours in Taiwan and attending tours in Taiwan as a foreigner is that sometimes the tour guides assume that I know things that I don't actually know. So I hope that will help you in your futures at NTM, giving tours to people from all around the world. And so first I would like to introduce myself a little bit. I have been in Taiwan for almost 10 years now. I first came here in 2012 as an exchange student. And I liked it so much that after my exchange was up, I decided to come back and study Chinese. And then after studying Chinese, I ended up studying interpreting, translation and interpreting at NTU. And through learning interpreting at NTU, I came across this program that National Taiwan Museum was doing, which is the International Docent program. And I thought, well, it's quite fun. I want to learn about the museums, I want to learn about the history of Taiwan, so I signed up. But I didn't realize just how many things I would learn just by being here and how much that would help my overall career as an interpreter by just being able to speak in public very often with people from all around the world. Because after all, interpreters end up speaking with people from many countries, from people who don't have the same background knowledge as you, and from people who don't speak the same language as you, or who speak maybe the same language, but they're different levels of proficiency. And right now I work as a full-time translator at Formosa TV, which in Chinese is 民视, because we have an English news program. So my job is translating news from Chinese into English. And sometimes the stuff that I learn at the museum, I put to work to use at work, because when we write news pieces about Taiwan, we're writing them so that people from all around the world can understand them. And so we have to be very clear, and we have to work with the assumption that not everybody around the world knows anything about Taiwan. So every single time that we write a piece, we have to pretend that we are writing it for someone who has zero knowledge about Taiwan, while at the same time, not having every piece come with like a 3-page introduction about the history of Taiwan. You know what I mean? So you have to find a balance between being informative enough so that someone understands and also not being too long, because you don't want to bore people before getting to the actual news. And it also works with the tour. Like if you give too much information, then people get bored and they leave and they think that your tour is boring. So let's get started, I guess. I'll be going through maybe 2 things today. I might also be giving you some interpreting tips. because if you work as an international docent in the museum, you might have to do a little bit of translation, but we'll see depending on the time. It will mostly center on tours. So, first things first. Before you start a tour, what do? You write a script, right? Maybe, wait, have you gone through training already? Or you are going through training right now, right? Have you attended a tour in the museum? With the walking tour? Or, yeah. So the walking tour was developed by, well, I mean, basically Phaedra, by me, by Eliza over there. We started off with a very bare skeleton of what we wanted to show international visitors. And then through time, we ended up developing a list of things that we wanted to talk about. And this list of things is what I call the script. When I'm saying script, I don't mean literally writing out a script that you memorize and then you repeat it to the visitors. When I'm talking about a script, I'm talking about what are the important points that I want to talk about in the tour. And then when the time of the tour is happening, you freestyle it and you adapt it to different situations, because every single tour is completely different. The people who attend the tour are different, and maybe even the space is different. Maybe there's construction somewhere, or maybe the exhibition has changed. So there are some things that you need to keep in mind. The first one is that different visitors will have different motivations for participating in a tour. That is, some people might join the tour to learn about history. Some people might join the tour just because they think it's fun. Some people might be tourists trying to learn about a new country. Some people might be people living here trying to learn about their own country. Some people might be forced to attend the tour. And this happens all the time. Like sometimes we have school kids who don't want to be here. They don't care. Like they just don't care what you're saying, right? So you have to adjust your tour. You can't just repeat the same thing just because they don't care. Like we have had people literally playing cards during the tour because they just were so uninterested in it. But that aside, like most people will actually want to listen to what you're saying. And so your goal is to satisfy their curiosity. They will have a lot of questions about Taiwan, about Taipei, about the museum, and your job as a tour guide is to answer those questions in a way that's entertaining and also informative. And keeping it on theme is something that I guess here you don't really have to think about too much because you're working at a museum, so everything that you do will have a theme. So if it's a walking tour of Taipei, then the theme is Taipei history. If you're giving a tour of this floor's exhibition, then the theme is discovering Taiwan, right? Like, it doesn't really apply so much. But for example, in the Blast to the Past tour, which is a walking tour of Taipei, there's people who might have different kinds of questions about it. So for example, why does Taipei look like this, right? You want to answer this question. Why is Taipei here? What happened in Taipei? How people in Taipei live, right? This is maybe different people will have these different questions. Maybe someone who is coming to Taiwan for the first time might want to know how people live here, right? But if you're living here, then you don't care about this. Or like, you know, what happened here, you might see some historical monument like the 228 Massacre Memorial Monument, and then you might wonder, well, why is this here? Why? What happened? What led up to this? So it's different questions. If you give the other tour, which I think you might have also gone in, have you gone in the short 20-minute tour of the building?
So yesterday it was a 2.5 hour tour around the building and 2 to 8 pieces.
Oh, so there's one tour that we used to do before the pandemic, which was a 20-minute tour of the main building museum, of the building of the museum, like not actually of any exhibitions, but the building itself. And so we talked mainly about the architecture, because even without talking about the exhibitions here, people might be curious already to learn about the museum. So they might wonder, well, if they're walking outside, they might just see the building and think, well, what is this, right? Simply answering that question already satisfies it. But maybe somebody who already knows that this is National Taiwan Museum and someone who might be a little more familiar with Taipei history might walk past and they just, you know, maybe they walk past a million times and they always think, well, why does it look like this? Why does it look so Western? Why do we have like a Greek/Roman building in the middle of Taipei, right? That takes another layer of knowledge that you have to explain, right? It's not so simple. It's the museum. You also have to explain the architecture. And then maybe someone who already knows architecture might want to know, how did the architects design it? What was their ideas behind it, right? It's not only an explanation of, this is the museum, it's built in a Western style, and you also have to explain, well, these are the little details that the architects made so that the building was more beautiful, or what the things symbolize, right? You saw the little hidden emblems in the museum, in the lamps. You know, those kinds of things, like those are things that you would only really know if a tour guide pointed them out to you, right? So that is your job. I don't know if you have had a tour of the third floor exhibition, but then this is another example, right? 3 different levels of knowledge about Taiwan. Someone who doesn't know anything about Taiwan might just be happy knowing what there is in Taiwan, what kind of animals live here, what kind of plants grow here. Someone who knows a little bit more, then they might see these things and might wonder, well, that is a clouded leopard, but what actually is it? Like, it's a taxidermy, right? How did this taxidermy come here? Or if you're more expert on Taiwan or more expert on indigenous issues, you might be wondering, well, how did these things get to be here? Especially with indigenous artifacts, like a lot of the items have an interesting history, right? How did they leave their place in a Paiwan tribe 100 years ago and they came to this museum? Maybe that's a story that's worth telling to people who are very interested in things like colonialism or decolonialism, right? So something to keep in mind. And before I go into like more concrete examples, like there's one thing that I find extremely important, which is like when you give the tour, you do not just want to give facts. You want to make it interesting. You don't want to say something and then the audience kind of just stays like, okay, right? Like if you just come up to the museum and say, oh, this is museum, it's built in a neoclassical style, it was built in 1915, it has 4 exhibitions and 32 columns in the lobby, they don't care, right? Who cares? So what? You have to make it a little bit more juicy, right? You have to make it interesting in a way that sounds appealing. You can say the same facts, but you can present them in a way that makes it interesting. And we will talk a little bit about that later as well. But for example, did you talk about this in your tour yesterday? About the bowls? Does anyone remember? Yes? Okay. So I once attended a tour here at National Taiwan Museum given by a docent, one of the Chinese-speaking docents. And it was a tour, the tour was supposed to last 1 hour. I already knew a lot of the stuff because I had been working here. I came here as a part of a different thing. But somehow we spent 14 minutes talking about this ox. And it was so boring. He was telling us about the kind of bronze that was used. He was telling us about the location of the ox, about how it moved here, how the ox symbolizes I don't know what in like Chinese culture. And it's like everyone was completely tuned out. Like he just kept talking about the ox and the ox and the ox, and like no one cared. Right? He was like, oh, it's located there. Like, I know, I can see it, right? Like, it's located in front of the museum. Okay, so what? Avoid that, okay? Avoid just repeating the same information or repeating things that are obvious. Of course, the ox is in front of the museum. Like, I can see it. I'm standing right here, right? Don't say obvious things. Or like, I see sometimes in the exhibition here, they say, oh, these are indigenous artifacts. And I'm like, okay, I can see that. And one thing to keep in mind when doing this, to keep the so what thing, is numbers tend to lose meaning, right? When you're talking about dates and when you're talking about how many columns the lobby has or how many, you know, unless it's like a very large number or something that's impressive, right? Like if it's a bracelet and it's like, oh, this bracelet has 1 million beads, then oh, wow, amazing. But if it's not, then just avoid it. And then we're going to be talking a lot about this. Like, don't say the names of things. You have to put them in a context. Because if you just have names, nobody knows how to link it to themselves or to the rest of the story. And so another way to add a little bit of juiciness of the so what factor is you can create drama. And this is an example that I use a lot in the walking tour of Taipei. When we are walking around the back of the park, you can see these pagodas, right? I guess you saw them in the tour yesterday. So one way that I tried to talk about it, because it's a little bit sudden to introduce the pagodas, because they don't kind of blend in with the rest of the story. So I will just say, well, if you look behind you, you will see these amazing ancient Chinese buildings. They look very old, right? And I will tell a story about how when I came to Taiwan for the first time, I would see all these things, and I would think that they were basically from like the Tang Dynasty or, you know, built thousands of years ago. And so I tell them the story about how I was so ignorant and how I didn't know anything. And it's like, actually, well, they're not old. They are very new. They were only built in the 70s, right? They're only at most 60 years old. And so this, you're still giving the information that these were built in the 70s, right? And you're still giving the information that they were built in a Chinese style. But you're doing it in a way that at least you're telling a story. I thought they were ancient, but they're actually new. And then you're also doing the same as the people, because a lot of the people that attend the tour and they don't know about Taiwanese history, they might also see these things and they will genuinely believe that these things have been standing here for like 1,000 years. It's true, because people just don't know a lot about the history of Taiwan. Like, I mean, outside, before I came to Taiwan, I didn't know anything about Taiwan. We just don't get taught about it in school. Anyway, so delivering the tour. I'm going to be using some examples from my own country to try and get you to understand just how difficult it is to understand a tour guide who is bad, and how you can overcome some difficulties while you give the tour that will make it more interesting. And so in the next 4 or 5 examples, I'm going to be putting pictures of my own country, which is Spain, and try to, hopefully no one knows about the history of Spain. Does anyone know the history of Spain? No? Great. I mean, visit someday, hopefully. So I'm not sure whether I want to give the bad example first. Okay, I'll just do that. So let's pretend that we're in a tour somewhere in Spain. Okay, and I'm the tour guide, and I'm a very bad tour guide. And we're walking here, okay, and I'm just going to explain to you what this is. So this is the Courtyard of Lions at the Alhambra in Granada. They were built during the Nasrid period of the Caliphate of Granada, and it was built in a Mozarabic style. Do you care? No. Do you understand what I just said? Probably not. Who built this? Anyone? What style is this built in? Anyone? No? Right. Very hard. Someone from Spain would have no problem understanding all of this, because this is something that everyone is very familiar with, right? So instead, you want to first start with a little introduction, right? Maybe you can start the introduction with a little bit of interaction, right? So for example, if you didn't know that this picture was from a place in Spain, where would you think this is? Can I have some answers, actually? What does this look like to you? I'm not going to continue. Sorry? Middle Eastern, yeah. It looks Middle Eastern. Any other volunteers over here? Asia. Where in Asia, more or less, would you say? Thailand. Because it's very ornate right at the top. Right, so would you think this is Spain just by looking at it? No. That's right. That's because this was built during the Arab rule of Spain. There was a time of 700 years where Spain was under Muslim rule. And these Muslim rulers, they were separated into different kingdoms called caliphates. One of the caliphates that lasted the longest time in Spain was the Caliphate of Granada in the south of Spain. And this caliphate that ruled from the end of the Roman Empire until the discovery of America, basically. So 700 years is a long time to build things, right? And this was one of the things that was built during those 700 years. It is a palace for the rulers of the Granada Caliphate. And the rulers were very interested in Arabic art. So they made sure that the building was built in a very Arab style. the style is called Nasrid because it is very ornate at the top. And now that you mention it, it looks very similar to Thailand. I had actually never considered that, but maybe if you explain this to someone from Thailand, you could also, draw the similarities. You've learned something about Spain, right? Did you know that Spain was ruled by Arab people? No, right? Like, you learned something. So what can you learn from this point? The point is, you have to give a timeline before you start, right? Because nobody will know what you're talking about. If I didn't tell you that there was this part of history of Spain, you probably wouldn't know. You would just be so confused. Like, why does this look so Arab? Like in Spain, you usually just think of houses with like the red bricks or all that kind of stuff. So in Taiwan, you can give a very simple timeline. Before you start the tour, at the very, very beginning, right, you want to make sure that everybody knows what you're going to be talking about. And so we can have like a little bit of like a long timeline in Taiwan, right? There's many different things. We have Spanish Formosa, the Qing Dynasty, the Formosan Republic, martial law. Like, you can give a lot of detail, right? But like, you also have to gauge like how much knowledge the audience has. And usually if there is at least one single foreigner in the audience, you will have to explain everything from zero. And even something like this with 8 parts might be too much, 9 parts might be too much for someone to just understand in like one moment at the very beginning of the tour. So you can give a very simplified version, just like I gave a very simplified version. Split it into 4 parts, or in fact, split it into 3 parts. When you attended the walking tour yesterday, at the very beginning, did they do this? I think they might have, right? Like, you have, at the very beginning, we're like, okay, so in...
各位来宾您好，本馆在上午11点整有一场动画影片放映，欢迎有兴趣的来宾至3楼儿童剧场观赏。
Did you do it?
Yeah, I didn't know that's the button, but anyway.
Oh. So, at the very beginning, and this is something that we started doing after the first few times that we did the walking tour, is we make sure that everybody understands that we're going to be talking about 3 specific periods of Taiwan. So we make it very absolutely clear. We even have a page on the folder book, and we're like, today we're going to be talking about 3 periods of Taiwan history: the Qing Dynasty, the Japanese colonial period, and the Republic of China period. And then we go. The Qing Dynasty was when Taiwan was ruled by the emperor in Beijing. It lasted until the end of the 19th century. Then we have the Japanese colonial times, which is when Taiwan was ruled by Japan. This happened after China lost a war against Japan, and then Taiwan was given to Japan as kind of a reward for winning the war. This period lasted 50 years. And in fact, you can keep explaining. So during this 50 years, Taipei was developed greatly. And today we're going to be talking a lot about the Japanese colonial period because the building that we are going to be seeing, the National Taiwan Museum, was built then. Many of the Taipei city streets were built then. And this entire area went through huge changes during the Japanese colonial period. So when you hear a Japanese name or you hear something about Japan, don't be scared. We are still talking about Taiwan. And then the 3rd period is the Republic of China period. And the Republic of China period is when we're going to be talking about after World War II, when Taiwan was ruled by the ROC government, at the beginning with the capital in Beijing, then in Nanjing, and then all the way in Taipei. And you want to make it simple, right? 3 periods, what are they? Even if you didn't know anything before, you at least know that there is different parts and that there is different rulers in each part. And then during the tour, now that everybody knows these basic things about Taiwan, you can add more details and you can make them a little bit more profound. And I don't know if, yeah, and so this is the problem here. Okay, so this is a problem because a lot of people don't know the difference between the Republic of China, or 中华民国, and the People's Republic of China, the 中华人民共和国. Of course, you all know, and I know, and everybody here knows that there's a difference, but you might have to explain this to a foreigner who doesn't know anything about Taiwan and colonial period kind of helps people understand that the two sides kind of developed separately, except for like, you know, a little bit of an overlap of 5 years. There was very limited exchanges between the two sides for a very long time. And then you can figure out how you want to explain this to the audiences. It can be a bit difficult. So you can also just avoid it if you want. I mean, after all, you're not going to be talking about the ROC too much. But if someone asks, you have to be ready to have an answer and something that you can explain relatively fast and in relatively simple terms. So up to you how you go about this. And also when it comes to words like this, like ROC and PRC, right? Like Republic of China, People's Republic of China. You also want to avoid things like this. Like, I mean, this is more current, so I guess if you're talking about like, you know, more recent history, it might apply. Things like KMT, 国民党, right? If you say it to someone who's from outside Taiwan, they have no idea what the KMT is. You have to explain, well, this was the party that was ruling for a long time, and they had essentially a dictatorship over Taiwan. You know, you have to provide a little bit of context, right? Because if you say, oh, the ROC was ruled by the KMT, they don't know what you're talking about. I mean, obviously we have DPP, MPP. Things like this also like are very confusing about politics. Again, this is more recent history, but blue to someone from outside Taiwan doesn't mean anything. Like if you say like a blue party or a blue government, they don't know. And if you say a green government, they think about ecological and like, you know, protecting the earth and things like this, right? But in Taiwan, they mean completely different things. And then, you know, this also applies to I think I'm going to talk about this later. So one way to avoid this problem of bringing up a bunch of words that have no meaning is by putting things into a context, right? So I'm going to give another bad example from my country. So let's say we are in the city of Toledo in Spain, and I'm talking about these two people. I would say, well, if I'm a bad tour guide, I would say, well, on the right here, we have Fernando of Aragon, and then of Castilla, and Isabel de Aragon. They were the two rulers of Spain, and through their marriage in 1492, they created a united Spain, uniting the Iberian Peninsula. Cool. So, first of all, do you remember their names? Who's that? Isabella is this one, not that one. This one is Isabella. Where is she from? Aragon. Oh, wait, you know this? You know the history of Spain? Or you learned? Anyway, two people know the answers, the rest don't know anything, and you're still a little bit confused. But basically, you need to like maybe clear this up a little bit more. So if I were a better guide, I would probably introduce a little bit of the history first. So up until the end of the 15th century, Spain was divided in two halves, basically. The eastern half was the kingdom of Castile, and the western half was the kingdom of Aragon. And so the kingdom of Aragon was ruled by Mr. Ferdinand, and Mr. Ferdinand was part of a royal family that had ties all around Europe. And then on the other half of Spain, we had Isabel. And through their marriage at the end of the 15th century, became a united Spain. And this is the first time in history that you have like one Spain rather than many kingdoms, right? Remember before we were talking about the Muslim rule of Spain, where there was like a lot of very tiny kingdoms? Well, now we have two halves, and the two halves unite. And that for a lot of people is considered the beginning of modern Spain. Also, after their marriage was the huge expansion of the Spanish Empire when they started basically killing thousands of people in America and colonizing everybody. And that is all because of the union of these two people, who, by the way, also kicked out the Muslim people from Spain. So this is right after the Muslim war of Spain. Maybe you learned a little bit more. Hopefully, you learned a little bit about Taiwan, about Spain. And so this kind of stuff happens in Taiwan all the time because there's a lot of names and a lot of very important people. And in this museum, we have two very important people, right, that you heard about in the tours. And those are Kodama Gentaro and Goto Shinpei. But if you say this is a memorial hall for this was a memorial hall for Kodama Gentaro and Goto Shinpei, nobody knows who they are, they don't know what they did, and they don't know why they're being memorialized. So you have to add a little bit of an explanation. When you first introduce them, you have already introduced the history of Taiwan, you have already introduced why there's Japanese people here. And so when you bring up the names, you want to clarify it every single time that you bring them up. You say, Kodama Gentaro, the general governor of Taiwan at the time, right? Or even general governor might be a little bit of a fancy word. You might want to say the ruler of Taiwan at the time. And Goto Shinpei, his civil administrator. Civil administrator, maybe you could say his helper. I don't know, it's a little bit simpler. We're memorialized in this building, right? But you have to add some kind of explanation. If you just leave it like this, Kodama Gentaro and Goto Shinpei were memorials in this building, like this is boring, right? You're just giving a fact. They can read this in a book, right? And there would be no difference. So you explain it every single time. And then they were memorialized in this building. It's like, why? Well, they did this, right? You don't just want to say this. You want to add an explanation and make it a little bit into a story. And then again, you can always get away, or almost always, you can get away with just not saying any names at all. Like, don't say names. Because names are very difficult to remember. And especially names in a foreign language are very difficult to remember, right? You will probably all struggle remembering Spanish names as much as Spanish people who come here will have trouble remembering names in Mandarin, Japanese, and sometimes Taiwanese. Okay, like this is a lot to take in for someone who is not familiar with how names work. And I'm gonna give you a fantastic example from my own hometown. For a little background knowledge, so like my hometown was founded during the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And so a lot of the names that I'm going to be talking about now are in Latin. So let's see how many you remember after I tell you. I'm a bad tour guide, so if I come up to this statue, I would just say, well, here we have the founders of Lucus Augusti, the capital of Galicia in Hispania. On the right, we have Augustus Maximus, and on the left, we have Fabio Octavio. And together, they founded the city of Lucus Augusti on the river Minho to defend Galicia from the rest of the Vandals that were in the area, which was a former lug settlement. So, who's that? Any names? Actually, do you remember any names that I said in Latin? Augustus. Yeah, I mean, everyone remembers Augustus, but like any of the other names? Huh? Fabio Octavio. Okay, well, Fabio too, fine. And then what's the city called? What's the province called? What's the country called? Right. Very difficult. And if you had to remember this on the spot just by hearing it once, you would not remember. So you could just simply say, this statue shows the emperor with his delegate in Spain, who founded the city of Lugo in northwestern Spain, next to the river. I used no names, but I gave you the same information basically, right? Like, and you can add more, like if you're gonna be talking about them a long time, then of course you wanna mention the names, right? But after you introduce them for the first time, you don't want to keep saying their names. So like if I introduce Augustus for the first time, right, and Fabius on the other side, then I wouldn't refer to them as Augustus in the following speech, right? I would refer to it as the emperor. And in Taiwan, for example, this might be a little more clear. If I'm talking about Taiwan, right, I wouldn't just be talking, oh, Taiwan did this, Taiwan did that, because people will forget who Taiwan, well, maybe not Taiwan, because she's the president, but like someone might struggle to remember the name, right? And so you can just avoid saying Taiwan altogether if you just say the current president, the president, right? It doesn't make a difference. You're just making it easier for your audience to understand, right? If you say the president did this, the president did that, it's the same as saying Taiwan did this, Taiwan did that. I mean, this applies to everybody else, right? Ma Ying-jeou, the previous president, a former president. Or actually, this is great. The man we talked about just now. It links people, like one story with the other, right? If you're talking about Kodama Gentaro, you can say the man in the building, right? Like, you don't have to use their names. This also works for places. Geelong. If you keep talking about Geelong, then okay, then they will probably remember the name Geelong. But if you're only going to mention it once or twice, right? Like when the troops came to Taiwan, they arrived in Geelong. And so you can just say they arrived in a city to the northeast of Taiwan. It works perfectly fine. They probably won't remember that it's Geelong. And if they have any questions, they can ask you, oh, which city? And then you say, oh, it's Geelong. Or this also works, especially in Taiwan, because you don't know, like, people just don't know the legislation, they don't know what it is, so you can just say the parliament, right? This applies to every proper name, like every proper noun, like be it a person, a place, a period of time, and even things like legal things, right? Like this is an example that I like to bring up because it actually comes up in our tour of Taipei. You just straight up, like even after you mention it the first time, you sometimes don't even have to say it even once. So if you say like, you know, back in, what was it, 2017, Taiwan passed? No, I'm not sure what, 17, right?
For the highest court to
Yeah.
unconstitutional.
So in 2017, the highest court in Taiwan passed the Enforcement Act of Judicial Yuan Interpretation number 748. Nobody knows what do you, I mean, because it says here, right? But just by looking at it, you don't know what it is. Just by saying it, you don't know what it is. So just forget about it. Like nobody cares about the official name. Literally nobody cares. So just say, well, in 2017, the highest court in Taiwan passed an act to legalize same-sex marriage. And now everybody knows what you're saying, right? If you say this, nobody knows what you're saying. And so another thing that you have to keep in mind when you give the tour is like, it's kind of like an example of what I've been doing throughout this entire presentation. You have to have some kind of structure to your tour. You can't just start things off midway and like then just keep going, right? Like it was a little bit like that with the photographs because we're not really there in the place. And so I just start suddenly talking about something. But you have to find a way to connect the different things that you're talking about in the tour. You just don't want to start, say, like walk around to the train and be like, okay, so now we're going to talk about the train. And then now we're going to talk about the building. You have to connect these two different ideas, right? And so every single time, with the main tour, right, we have the introduction with the 3 periods of history. We have the different sections of the tour, and we have the end. But each of the small sections of the tour will also have a structure like this, right? An introduction. So we're going to be talking about the building's architecture. And then we're going to be talking about, you know, you have to give a warning. Now we're going to talk about this. Now we're going to go to this place. You have to signal what you're going to be talking about to the people that you're taking so that they can, you know, be mentally ready, like that 心理准备, right? It's not really like they're like really afraid of what you're going to say, but that being aware of what's coming will make you adjust your expectations and prepare for it. And so sometimes like there's So sometimes there's like ways that you can connect the different stories. So for example, chronologically, right? So if you're starting the tour and you're talking about the early Japanese period when the Japanese troops first came to Taiwan, and we're talking about this in Beiman, right? Like when the troops first came through the gates. Then if we turn around and we talk about the post office behind us, that's a little bit later on in the Japanese colonial period. So to move from one topic to the next, we can just say, well, now we're going to delve into the later Japanese colonial rule, right? Like it's just a connection, and the person who you're speaking with knows, okay, we're still talking about the same thing, but it happened a little bit later, right? It just makes them understand it more easily. Some other things is like pointing out points in common. So in the lobby of this building, I don't know how your tour went, but the way that I usually do it is like I talk about how the government spent a lot of money in building this building, right? They used all the fanciest equipment, all the fanciest materials, and they really broke the bank. In fact, they ran out of money. I don't know if you guys remember this from the tour, but they were using all this important marble, all this high quality construction, and they had a lot of details. So a way to connect it with the next story, maybe with the thing about the lamps, would be like, well, it's not just the materials that are special, it's also the way that they use the materials that are special. And then you like, please come over here, and then you show them the lamp, right? Try to find things that connect to different topics. It doesn't have to be chronological, it doesn't have to be points in common. Sometimes it can just be really weak. You can just say something like, okay, now we're gonna move over here, and we're gonna talk about, and then you just say, like, we're gonna talk about gay rights in Asia, right? Like, it's very sudden, but at least they know what's coming. And the last point of this kind of section is that I think is kind of important to add a little bit of humanity in your tour. And so humanity can be added in a lot of ways. And one of them, I mean, the most simple ones is simply by interacting with your audience, right? Like asking them questions, asking them for their opinions. We kind of did that a little bit in the, when I asked you, oh, what does this building look like, right? Where if you didn't know this building was in Spain, where do you think it would be? That's kind of interaction, right? The same thing happens if we're here in Taiwan, right? Like when we're outside of the museum building, we usually ask our audience, like, well, have you seen buildings like this before? Right? And then maybe they tell you, yeah, I've seen the British Museum looks like this, or the White House, right? You have to also make sure that the questions that you ask or the way that you interact with the public is not too intense. Like you can ask them to guess things, right? Like for example, outside of the train, we usually ask them like, oh, how fast do you think the train went, right? I mean, most people don't really know about train speeds. I don't really know a lot about train speeds, but it's a fun question, right? Like, oh, 30 kilometers an hour, or 50, or 100. Sometimes people are like, oh, 300 kilometers an hour. I'm like, is this like the high-speed rail or something? This is like from 100 years ago, but it's just for fun, right? But you don't want to ask something like, where do you think this train was manufactured, right? Like, if you see the train, like, nobody would really know if it's a German train or an Italian train or what kind of train it is, right? So, like, you have to find a way to, like, make it that it's interactive and you're asking questions, but that those questions don't put a lot of pressure, right? Like, you don't want to stand in front of the museum building and see, like, oh, look at this column. Does anyone know what kind of column this is? I mean, maybe some people will know, actually, but not a lot. And like another way to do interaction is with the lamps, for example, inside the museum, right? We do the things like, I don't know if this happened during your tour, but what I like to tell them is like, well, there is little symbols hidden in the room. Can you find these hidden symbols, right? I show them a picture of what the family, did you give the tour? Who gave the tour yesterday? We show them a picture of the symbols of Kodama Gentaro and Goto Shinpei. And then we're like, oh, can you find these symbols somewhere in this room, right? And then it's a little bit of interaction, right? Like, and then they kind of look around and nobody ever finds them. And then like, I tell them, well, I'm gonna give you a little secret. And then you point, it's like, oh, look, there's look at this lamp. They have the symbols over here, right? It's a little bit more fun than just being like, if you look over here, you will find the symbols, right? It's something that's kind of like an adventure, right, in the tour. Or like sometimes even small things like not only so that the audience doesn't just have to listen to you and look, you can also ask them to touch or to do certain things, right? Like inside the museum, I always ask the visitors to touch the wall, right? Like if you're in the ground floor, in the main lobby, the ground floor is made with marble, right? And so I'm like, oh, okay, so you have heard that there's this grand building with all these grand materials. Please touch the wall. It's wonderful marble, right? Like feel it and give me some adjectives. How does it feel? And they say, oh, it feels cold, it feels smooth, it feels hard. Great. And then I go to the back of the room and I'm like, okay, now touch here. How does this one feel? And then they touch and it's like, oh, it looks cheap. Oh, it's wood or something. And then because they have touched both of them, then that's when you explain, well, the main building was built with a lot of money, but they run out of money halfway, so that the back wall, they just had to paint it over, right? Like, did this happen at the tour yesterday? Yeah, right? Like, it's a little bit more interesting than just saying, look, this is marble, look, this is plaster, right? Like, it's a little more active. And another way to make the tour real is to relate it to, oh wait, no, this is not what I was going to talk about. Well, to make it personal. There's another point that I forgot in the middle, but we'll talk about it in a bit. So it's to add like a human dimension to it and relate the tour and the contents of the tour to yourself. It might seem hard, but you are Taiwanese. Well, most of you are Taiwanese. And so the things that we talk about in the tour have affected you in some way or another, like it or not. Maybe not directly, but it has affected your parents, your grandparents, and maybe something as simple as you taking a walk around the park. And so again, with an example from my own hometown, if I were a bad tour guide, or I mean, not a bad one, but like a regular one, I would tell you about the city walls, right? Like, as I mentioned before, my hometown was founded during Roman. I don't know why the pictures are so bad quality. It was founded during Roman times, and during Roman times they built a wall to defend the city, and it goes all the way around the center. So it was built 2,000 years ago. And you might think, well, how can you relate a wall built 2,000 years ago with me living here in the present day? And so the way that I would do it is I would simply tell you, well, I would tell you all the information about the wall, like how many things it has, or like, you know, when it was built and all these things. But then to make it more human, I tell you, well, every time that I go back to my hometown in Spain, one of the first things that I do with my friends is actually take a walk along the top of the wall. Because by taking a walk around the entire city center, I can see how the city has changed while I was away in Taiwan. And this was especially the case when I came back after the pandemic for the first time in like almost 3 years, like this summer, right? Like one of the first things that I did when I went back was just like, I went with my mom and we walked around the top of the wall and saw the city. All right, so that connects this war equipment from 2 millennia ago with me, right? Like with the present day. It makes it a little bit more interesting, I think. And so in Taipei, I mean, I'm assuming most of you live in Taipei, right? So like simply by being here or being in Taiwan, you must have walked past Beimen, right? Or Nanmen, or maybe you took a walk in the 228 Park, or maybe in the stage at the 228 Park, you performed there or something. I don't know, like think about it in some way. Or like, you know, your grandparents and your parents, maybe your grandparents were alive in the Japanese colonial period. Were they? Perhaps, right? Like, so you can bring something like this up in the tour, right? Like if your grandparents speak Japanese, right? You can say, oh, my grandparents speak Japanese. Or you can talk about your parents, like if they were in the martial law periods, like, well, my parents were punished for speaking Taiwanese at school. I don't know. It depends on how much you want to share, and it also depends on how much, you know, how private this information is, or like how the mood feels, right? You might not want to chat with someone who is like a government official coming to the tour, right? They might not really care about this kind of stuff, but maybe if it's someone your age, then, you know, that's something to think about. And so sorry for the thing that I forgot. Making the tour real, another very important thing is to not just say good things. And this is something that I think we have been working quite hard at National Taiwan Museum to do, because after all, the museum itself was founded during a colonial government, right? Like, it was not founded by local Taiwanese people. And we're also talking about the current government, the Republic of China government, which has a dark past with the White Terror. And so if we're walking around Taipei and we're only saying, oh, how wonderful that the Japanese people built these buildings, and how wonderful that the Republic of China government came, or, you know, all these things, then it loses a lot of the authenticity. And it happens a lot in Taiwan, especially with government institutions. There is a very clear narrative that the institutions want to push, right? Like, you wouldn't really want to well, let me give you an example. So again, this is going back to Spain. And so just for a little bit of background information, Spain was, in the 20th century, before World War II, there was a civil war in Spain. And the winning side was the nationalist side. And the nationalist side was led by a man called Franco, who led Spain for 40 years, more or less. He was a dictator, okay? And a very ruthless one at that. But if I were a bad tour guide, I might just talk to you about the good things that happened. So this is one of the main squares in Madrid. And this is the first skyscraper in Spain. It was built during the 1960s because under Franco's policies and opening up Spain to tourism, the economy grew very, very fast during a very short period called the Spanish Miracle. And during this time, a lot of very fancy buildings were built, like these ones, and a lot of very nice parks and things. And so Spain became like a very important tourist destination in Europe. So I could just talk about the wonderful growth of the Spanish economy over the 1960s. And you would think, wow, Franco was wonderful. He made everybody get rich. But that's disingenuous, because during this very same time that this was being built, things like this were also being built. And I think, what is this? Well, this is a memorial for the people who fought on Franco's side, so the people in the nationalist government. But this was built by slave labor, and the slaves were basically Franco's opponents. Franco was a ruthless dictator. Anyone who he thought was communist, socialist, or who had some kind of friendship with communist or socialist countries, or anyone who was, people, even as things as like speaking local languages instead of Spanish, like speaking Catalan, Galician, or Basque, or people who were gay, or people who, anything who were not religious. Things like this could get you into a lot of trouble. During Franco's regime, you could get arrested and put into prison and executed, very similar to what happened in Taiwan during the Chiang Kai-shek leadership. And so sometimes these political prisoners would be sent to here to build this, to glorify the people that were oppressing them. And in fact, after Franco died, his body was put here as well, as a glory, as a testament to like how wonderful the dictator Franco was. And so if I don't tell you this half of the story, you're not actually learning critically about the history of Spain, right? Like, and in our tours at the museum, we talk a lot about very dark periods of Taiwanese history, right? Like we talk about the White Terror, we talk about how thousands of people were executed, arrested. We talk about comfort women, right? Like Japanese, like literal sex slaves, right? This is all very tough to stomach sometimes, like, and in fact, sometimes when I speak about some of these things, like I do get choked up in the thing because I feel like, this was a very miserable time. But there was one time, and I remember this, and this is why I think we need to talk more about these things. It's like once during a tour, after I was talking about, we had already talked about the White Terror and the 228 incident, and I spoke about like the comfort women in Taiwan and how the Japanese put a lot of women into sexual slavery, and how later on the Republic of China government kept doing the same thing in places like Jinmen up until the 1990s. This visitor came and she said, well, I don't think you should be talking about these things because it makes Taiwan look bad. I didn't really know what to say back then because it took me quite off guard. But now I think I would have told her that, well, look, every country has a dark period. Like every country has done some messed up things. Like Spain has done messed up things. And like, I mean, Europe has done a lot of messed up things all around the world. And so if you're only talking about the good things, especially the good things that people who were in power and who oppressed others were doing, then you're only helping the narrative and you're not helping move forward for policies or for education that are about transitional justice. And, sometimes people think, oh, it was so far in the past. Like, no, it's not. Like, this happened literally like when my mom was like a teenager, right? Like, and the White Terror affected your families at some point. In fact, the effects of the White Terror still affect Taiwan today, right? There's still discussions about, oh, should we remove Chiang Kai-shek from the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall? Should we rename the streets? These are all things that have repercussions even today. And so by ignoring these things, you're being really unfaithful to history. And also, I personally think that it's a bit of a disservice to all the people who suffered under like these brutal regimes, right? Both the Japanese regime and also like the Republic of China regime, especially in its early days. And so please try to do self-reflection, because there are many times that I have attended tours in Taiwan, and especially at government agencies, they will just tell you how wonderful, like, especially now, like if you go to like the Academia Historica or like the Defense Ministry's museum, they will just tell you how wonderful the Republic of China is and how wonderful Chiang Kai-shek's leadership is, or how Jiang Jingguo made like Taiwan's economy boom and all the, like they will tell you all the good things, but they won't tell you all the bad things. And so yeah, in Taiwan, what are these things? Like, I mean, I've talked about it, right? We can talk about the 228 incidents. I would say, like, if you have to talk about one of the things in the tour that is hard, then talk about this, because this changed Taiwanese society completely. You can also talk about comfort women and how time is running out, right? Like, this is a very urgent topic. And this is also not a topic that only affects Taiwan, right? Like, it's also a topic that affects other countries in Asia, like South Korea, the Philippines, and basically the entirety of Southeast Asia. And if you have, because sometimes I feel like when we have tourists from other parts of Asia, and especially from South Korea, who come to Taiwan, and we talk a lot about the Japanese colonial period. And the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan was very different from the Japanese colonial period in South Korea, right? In Taiwan, it's almost seen like as the beginning of modern Taiwan, whereas like in South Korea, it's like the end of good Korea, right? Like it was a humiliation, removing the royal family and like a lot of really messed up stuff. Also in China, the massacres, the Nanjing massacre, where thousands of people were killed, raped, murdered. Like, the Japanese government did a lot of really brutal stuff all around Asia. And so people from these countries, when they come to Taipei and we're like talking about, oh, look at this wonderful building, and like, look how pretty it is, and like how beautiful Taipei was, they might feel like, what is going on, right? Like, why are we praising this brutal government? So this might be something that you want to talk about, especially if you have tourists from South Korea. And if you have tourists from Japan, please say it anyway. Like, it might be a little uncomfortable. Deal with it, right? Like, history is uncomfortable, because especially this, like, a lot of people in Japan don't know about it. A lot of people in Japan who know about it don't want to talk about it. But please try to do your best way to explain it in a tactful way, right? Like, I mean, after all, the 15-year-old girl who was attending your tour did not, like, force women to get raped, like, in the war, right? Like, but, so don't be accusatory and don't be like, oh, it's your fault, you Japanese people suck. Like, make it nice and, like, but explain the facts. And even, do you know what this is from? What's it called? The Sunflower Revolution? I mean, this is so much more recent that I don't think you would talk about it in a tour, but perhaps you want to talk about it if you pass by some of the areas of this in your tours. And yeah, and the most important one, have fun, right? Like, you can 100% tell when a tour guide does not want to give a tour. You can 100% tell. Like, when the tour guide is just kind of like standing there and like going through the motions, just like telling you all the things, and you can tell that they don't care. If you don't care as a tour guide, no one in your audience will care. So like, even if you can see that there's kids who are not listening to you, it doesn't matter. Like, try to do your best and try to have fun. Like, enjoy the process of teaching people, right? Like, after all, you're teaching people, and enjoy the process of speaking with people. It doesn't have to be a serious tour. Like, our walking tour, although it is 3 hours long and it covers like 100 years of history, a lot of people say that it's very fun because, I mean, I personally love chatting with the people that come on the tour, right? Like, maybe we're walking from Beimen to Guanqianlu, and like, we're just chatting along the way, and they ask questions, we make friends. Like, there's people who I've met in the tours that we've kept in touch. And like, also by being very friendly and like talking with the people that attend your tours, you might get new opportunities, right? Like, sometimes people offer you, like, you know, to go to the class at school and give a talk, or to teach their children English, or, you know, or they offer you jobs and like, or French, you know. Sometimes people come several times to the same tour and they remember you, and they're like, oh, last time I came and you weren't here and I missed you. It's like, oh, that's lovely, right? Like, you do build a lot of relationships. So don't be tense. Don't act like you're, you know, a history professor or something. It is supposed to be fun. It is supposed to be entertaining. And so make it fun and make it entertaining, right? Like, don't be shy. I know that especially like if you give your first tour, you might be very nervous, and that's okay. But the more that you do it, the more fun you can have with it, and the more, you know, the more easygoing it will be. And when you are relaxed, the people that you're giving the tour to will be relaxed. And that's it. So thank you very much. Yeah. I have a second part of this, but I don't know if Phaedra wants to cover it, or maybe we can have some questions.
Oh yeah, questions.
First of all, yeah, do you have any questions? I've been doing this for like a long time.
Because they've been to the tour yesterday, although it's not really walking tour from the Beimen, but it's 2.5 hour tour. So. And
who gave the tour yesterday?
So basically, 2 of them here and 2 of them there, and 2 of them here are from the summer program.
Oh, okay.
Who have been to the long walking tour. Oh, 3 of them here.
Oh.
Summer program.
Wait, do you remember me from the walking tour? Was I there?
Were you?
Oh no, I was in Spain.
Yeah, he was in Spain. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, any questions? Please ask away.
Yesterday we had a discussion on the, you know, something. Probably we can discuss those questions. You know, with
what question?
People. I kind of forgot the question. Would you like to bring it up?
Yeah, sure. This question.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's relevant. So yesterday I was asking a bit about the political correctness of the tour, especially when touching like some delicate issues. It is hard not to have a stance. And yesterday, the response I got was that sort of that neutrality is a myth, in a sense, like we maintain some kind of neutrality on the surface, but it's actually kind of a myth because it's impossible not to take stances. You know, the way we look back at the White Terror, for instance, that is a stance, for instance. But, so, I'd like to push it a little bit further. This question is on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
How would you advise we give a tour if our audience were, let's say, mainland Chinese people?
I would do the same.
And, you know, how do we deal with these delicate issues? I mean, of course, we're not avoiding them. Of course, we're not going to shy away from them. But we're also sort of going to be preparing for confrontation or a very drastically different view. Yeah,
I mean, you do have to be ready to debate with some people. Like, the thing is, over the past 5 years that I have been giving tours, never has there been any kind of conflict, because although the tours have a bias, right? When we're talking about the White Terror period, we're obviously talking about it in a negative way, which might not necessarily be the same way that, say, someone who benefited from the White Terror period would talk about it, right? Someone who benefited from the White Terror would be very happy about, you know, the policies that were enacted. They would say that it's right. But the simple fact that they are coming to the tour already eliminates a lot of the people who wouldn't want to hear these things, right? So, like, I doubt that people who have very, say, pro KMT from that era leanings, or people who are very anti-Taiwan independence leanings or things like this wouldn't probably join our tour, right? Do you think they would?
Well, not sure.
I don't think they would.
It is a museum.
It is a museum.
You don't really expect what they're getting into.
That is true. It is a museum, but I think the simple fact of having to sign up for a tour and like being willing to hear a tour eliminates a lot of the people who would have conflict with you already. Like that's already a bias, right? Like, I mean, people who don't support, say people from China who don't support Taiwan independence or who are like very, very against Taiwan independence probably wouldn't visit Taiwan, right? They would? They wouldn't, right? Like that's the thing, like the mere act of coming to Taiwan already and joining a history tour, right, already puts them in a way that they are probably a little bit more open-minded to accept or to at least hear a different point of view, you know what I mean? So that already like would eliminate the conflict. And the thing about the political correctness, like we, regardless of who attends our tour, we always cover the same things. Like we're not gonna like not talk about comfort women just because it makes you uncomfortable. They were way more uncomfortable back then than you are in our tour, so you can put up with it. And like, it's not a conflict, but it's like, you know, sometimes when we have a lot of Japanese tourists, I think, I wonder what they're thinking when I would talk about it. But they're fine. Like I mean, they don't say anything. We never, I mean, but also Japanese tourists tend to not say a lot of things anyway to begin with, but they've never really, you know, they're willing to hear it. Whether they agree or not, then, you know, it's up to them. But like, I would say like, don't change the tone, right? Like there is a kind of balance, but you also have to keep in mind like that the people who were in power, they had an obscene amount of power, like all through the Japanese colonial period and through the Republic of China period. And so you can learn about their stories in many sources, right? Like there's books all written over it. Like if you go to most museums now, they will have a special narrative to it. So with this tour, we're trying to put more of the voices that maybe were not heard during that time, right? There's plenty of resources to learn about Chiang Kai-shek. There is not that many resources to learn about someone who died in the White Terror, right? So, yeah, it is biased. I agree.
Is that a young or is that something?
Yeah, please.
About neutrality, that if you have the chance to join the complete walking tour, that's at a certain point when we talk about the White Terror, we do our best to expose like every involved party's perspective. So people who were already in Taiwan, the Japanese fleeing back to Japan, the people from the mainland coming over to Taiwan. But exposing every single perspective should not shift into making excuses for the parties. So there is at a certain point the reality of the fact, even just by sheer numbers, like how many Taiwanese people were killed. Of course, the mainland people, like the people coming from the mainland, had their own reasons, but that doesn't make it correct to exterminate the Taiwanese people, right? So we cannot be completely neutral in the moment that we have victims and we have to advocate for them. So I think we try to explore all of the perspectives, and that's good, but we can't be expected to be neutral because we are also advocating for victims at the same time when we give our tours. Or for comfort women. Like, yeah, you can say that the Japanese soldiers who were abusing these comfort women, they themselves maybe did not want to join the war. They were dragged into it. But still, ultimately, who is the ultimate victim if not the comfort woman, right? So you can only keep neutrality and like balance to the point until you're speaking up on behalf of victims. I think that's important to remember as well.
Yeah. Do you have any specific fears about like people joining the tour who like?
Specific fear, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I brought up the mainland Chinese instance mostly because interacting with mainland Chinese, not on tour, but just day to
Yeah,
day
in
life,
real life.
is that they like to sort of, it's either they don't have like adversity towards Taiwan as a land. They have adversity towards the stance, but not the land itself.
Yeah.
Like they love the land. They love to have it for themselves, that kind of feeling. And they like to like call you family and stuff. And this is a sentiment that they feel so deeply that I sort of feel like this is something that they would speak up about if they joined the tour.
I mean,
which is, you can sort of, I mean, from our personal perspectives, it doesn't feel that nice, but as a tour guide, you have to also maintain that kind of professionalism as to not sort of like just start arguing with them, right? So I'm sort of just like touching on this delicate balance that we need to maintain.
I mean, I think you wouldn't argue. Like, I 100% believe that if someone, have we ever had anyone from China joining, actually?
I think so.
Once or twice.
I feel there was, but they're not in a group. They come in like one or two, and often in accompanying with their Taiwanese friend or international friend.
Yeah,
so
but
they
like
could be those who have quite different ideas.
Yeah, but like if you go to China, would you start an argument with a tour guide who talks about Taiwan as Taiwan province?
Well, I personally would not.
Yeah.
But
But you would expect that, right? Like if you go to China, you would expect that they would refer to Taiwan as like Taiwan province. So maybe when they come here, they would expect you to talk about it like Taiwan. I don't know. Yeah.
I also feel like this question is coming from my personally when conversations happen, instantly my mind like sort of splits between my own perspective and their perspective. And so I usually like just sort of perceive both at the same time.
Yeah.
And how to mediate between that would be a challenge.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I see what you mean.
You know that you feel bad about this, but you know that this is, you kind of have your own stance. You also know that like what they're saying is understandable, and now I try to make sure that they leave happy, and you kind of don't lose your own breath as well.
They can not leave happy. It's fine.
But I think one very important is how you take the question and how you respond to the question.
Yeah.
So if you have this mind to debate with your visitor, then it's going to be a debate. But if you consider this as a chance to accommodate different ideas, then that would be different. So usually that's the way we do. Because, for example, probably not on this issue, but we have other like European visitors gives us some additional information like, pineapple is a very important symbol for whales in Europe. This is something that we do not know and we haven't included in the tour, for example, in earlier times. Then we'll say, oh, really? And we will try to discuss with them and try to know what they know, what they see. And even if it's not, we're not sure if it's 100% correct, we can just say, well, thank you for your information. That is quite an interesting topic we can research into, and that's all.
Yeah, and usually like people don't really speak during the tour. Usually it's at the end when people like really tell you what they think, right? Like, and usually it's good stuff, right? Like usually they give you good feedback, and usually it's not a problem. You can just say, well, thank you for sharing your opinion with me, right? Like. That's all, and it is true. Like, thank you for sharing. Like, it's always interesting to hear like different perspectives, right? Like, we have had older people in the tour who, may be a little bit more of like, oh, well, the White Terror wasn't that bad. And like, well, thanks for sharing.
It happens during the tour. Like, it's never happened.
It's never happened. Yeah.
But in the case like someone comes, maybe someone signs up with the purpose of like stirring up some trouble. I don't think it's gonna happen. But if it does, you can still be professional and be like, oh, thank you. We value your opinion. How about we discuss that after the tour ends, because we are on a schedule and we have to move on to the next spot. Like you can still have a conversation with them without letting it affect the tour.
Yeah.
Because of course you also have to be mindful about everyone else who's there. Like you're concerned about them leaving unhappy. But how would you feel if you're trying to join a tour and listen to the history of Taiwan and suddenly the tour guide starts like having a full-blown political discussion with another, and you're like, I want to go eat my lunch, So you can just keep
Yeah.
I don't think there's too much to worry about when it comes to arguing during the tour. It's not going to happen, and if it happens, you can say, okay, we're going to talk about it later, please, let's keep on with it.
And it's like they might be unhappy about the content of the tour, but they might still be happy about the tour, you know, like they might not like what they're hearing, but if you're nice enough, they will still have a good experience anyway, I think. They might hate the content of the tour. They might hate that you were talking about the White Terror. They might hate that you were talking about the victims. But if you deal with it in a nice way, it's like, well, this is the way that our tour is thing. And like, we always like to hear a diversity of opinions. It's been great hearing your opinion. We will keep it into account to maybe have more voices in the future, blah, blah, blah. And they might still be happy anyway. But again, this never happened. And I've been doing this for 6 years now.
Yeah, and I think
like never happened.
Also the way we deliver these things is like we're either just trying to show you some basic knowledge about, you know, the spots, and also I think we have a very strong, intention of like caring a certain population and advocating for them, and I think that is quite important. If you're just criticizing, if you're there just to criticize a certain population, then probably that would be quite controversial, and not even for, you know, the average visitors will feel like that. But when we are actually advocating for, as Iago said, those who doesn't really have the chance to speak up for themselves, then that's actually more acceptable for the average visitors.
Yeah. It's like I also feel like, you know, in the tour we talk about gay rights, right? Not everyone who comes to our tour is going to support gay rights.
Yeah.
But not because there is someone who doesn't support it, we're not going to not talk about it, you know?
Yeah, we are not criticizing for people
like,
who doesn't support for gay right. We're talking about how people who are gay and they suffer from certain situations. So I guess that's pretty different. If we're just criticizing the momong.
Yeah, it's like we're not being like, hey, go out and like donate $20,000 to like this LGBT community. Like, it's simply saying like, look, this is what happened.
Yeah.
Take it or leave it, right? Like.
So somebody suffered in this certain site. I think that is the thing that we want to emphasize. Yeah. Not like, oh, somebody is doing something that we don't like, and we're trying to criticize them with this site. This is not our purpose.
I mean, as you can see, we have thought about these things a lot, right? Like,
Yeah, especially usually when I'm looking at the visitor and introducing the gay history, I was thinking, are they all like?
Especially when they're like older and like, or they have like a KMT sign here. You're like,
they all look okay.
Yeah, and like they were fine. They listened to it and they loved it. I mean, well, I don't know if they loved it, but they were, you know, I don't know. There's just not really a lot of conflict. Like a lot of times, like we get questions like, "Oh, what was your worst tour?" And like, what was, I don't know. I don't think there was such a bad thing as a bad tour. Like. Yeah, like the worst thing is that it rains.
Bad weather, but no bad tours.
Yeah, like I mean, tours can get pretty weird sometimes. Like, like I don't know, and it's not like weird, but like it was that one time like TEDx, when the the talk organizer came to the museum, like we were there was 300 people?
Yeah.
It was a lot of people, like all around. And like, so the tour the group that I was leading, they were like not interested in touring. So in the end, we sat, well, I mean, not the whole tour, but there was a time for like 20, 30 minutes where we were just sitting on the grass behind the museum, just chatting and looking at the squirrels and taking pictures of the squirrels. And then we just kept going, you know, it's like, okay, or it's fine. And that we had a docent who was giving a tour of like the train and stuff, and then this person came who apparently was like an expert in train, and he gave her the tour of the train, and then the things that she learned, like she told us, and then we added it to the tour. You know, it's always different, and like you've got to be flexible, and you've got to like, you know, and sometimes also like when people bring kids.
Yeah.
Like, that is always a challenge. Yeah,
they... You should tell them about the Pikachu.
I forget about it. I mean, all I remember is, like, the next day I saw him. And then they were like, oh, my God, you're the tour guide. And I was like, why is a kid speaking to me?
So basically, there was a guided tour in which we have several families come in with second grade,
Yeah.
second grader children, and second grader. I'm not sure if you know, but that this 3-hour-long walking tour. We are not really sure if they can take it. And their parents say, "Oh, don't worry," and they were wearing this very cute Pikachu raincoat, and there's several. It's so big because it's the whole Pikachu, like with the umbrella and also the something. I don't know. Anyway, several of them. And they were not really like standing still and listening. They were just walking around and playing around. And we thought they may not be really interested in the tour. But so next day.
No, the next day, like, it was like at a restaurant or something, and it was with Allison, and then this kid just comes up and is like, "Oh, it's you." Like, who's this kid? Why is he speaking to me?
So they liked the tour.
Like, they liked the tour. They remembered it, and they're like, "Oh, we had so much fun." I was like, "Oh, great." Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Yeah, who would have thought?
May I follow up on that? The kids point, we're not kids.
Yeah.
If there's like 1 or 2 kids in a whole tour of adults, and the kids weren't paying attention, as a tour guide, should you cater to the kids who are not paying attention? Not as in like, hey, stop fooling around. Not as in that, but as in like speak like you're talking to kids.
No. I mean,
yeah, how do you balance that?
Because our tours are not geared to kids, right? We're not offering kids tours. So if they bring kids, it's up to the parents to take care of them. Like, it's not our job to like do it down for kids. If we were advertising as like a kid-friendly tour or like a kids tour for kids, then yeah, you would have to like, speak a little more simple terms and things like that. But for the most part, like, we warn we don't warn. Like, we explain on the tour sign-up sheet, like, what the tour is going to be. Like, it's going to be a 3-hour walking tour talking about history, talking about Japanese colonial history, about the RSC. So, like, it is not for kids. It is okay if kids come, but it's not for them. So if they come and, like, they end up playing around, then just let them play around. It's the parents who have to take care of them. Like, we're not nannies, right? Like, we're not going to take care of their kids. Most of the time, they're fine, though.
Yeah, most of the time.
I mean, sometimes they ask questions and they interrupt. They're like, "Oh, what is this?" And you're like, "Oh, it's a column." Like, I don't know, like, it's these kinds of questions. Like, they love the birds in the park, and they just play with the birds, and you just let them play with the birds. Like, it doesn't
as
matter.
long as they look safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're always accompanied by their parents or by like a guardian or something. So like, usually they keep them relatively, and sometimes, like, if the parents see that the child is like not having a good time, they might just leave the tour early. Like, they sometimes, like, it does happen, and it's totally fine. Like, they just like, "Oh, look, I need to take care of the kid." And we're like, "Oh, it's okay, just give us the earphones and you can go." And in fact, this can apply to any of the participants. Like, they can leave anytime they want, and like, sometimes people do leave. Like, rarely. I mean, sometimes it's because they have other appointments, but like, it's not a big deal. Like, yeah. Or they come late. I mean, it's more of a deal if they come late, because then you have to like take everything out, and like then.
You can interact with them though if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, to make them feel included. Yes. It's just, for example, we ask questions a lot during our tour. You can just ask them directly, like the little kid, and then maybe they respond correctly, and you're like, "Oh, you're so good," and they're so happy because they answer correctly, and then they're in the situation. So, but there's no need to like derail the whole tour. Once again, like, you're giving a tour to a group of people.
Yeah.
So if someone, like a singular person, has different needs, you might want to like kind of.
Like, the worst is when it's like a group of teenagers. Like, that's the worst demographic, because they don't care. They really don't care what you say. They don't care, and like, you can see that there's only like a group of like 20, 30 people, and like only 5 of them are listening to you. That just doesn't feel great, because the rest of them are kind of just like trolling, especially if they're like walking, they're walking like this. And then, it kind of like, you can't let that affect you. Like, for me, that's the worst, right? When I can totally tell that 80% of them were forced to come here. And like, that's kind of like the teacher's fault, right? Like, or whoever brought them. It's like, don't come. Like, don't force people to do things that they don't want to, right? Because they clearly don't want to be here. But like, you still have to be professional and you still have to like carry on with the tour for the people who do care, right? Because like even in a large group, there's always like a few people who do care. And sometimes it's great, like when people ask questions and they're very interested, like it's like for me, the ideal group is like a group of like say 6 or 7 people, max 10, who really care about this kind of stuff. And like you can really tell when they care, when from beginning to end they give input, they comment, they ask questions, they laugh at your jokes, they are engaged, and they're not just like, it's a very different feeling because you feel like you're almost with a group of friends, I guess, like temporary friends that you're just like talking and chatting with, and it's not someone whose eyes are like glazed over, right? And then it's like trying to reach them. Yeah. Kids are not a problem.
But,
yeah.
but I have to say, if we're given a guided tour around 20 to 30 minutes and there are several kids, it's different situation. Like if it's a museum, like indoor tour, it's different situation, and we'll be mentioning that next week. But the walking tour, it's 3 hours long. We have a question in the questionnaire, registration questionnaire, saying, do you know it is a 3-hour-long walking tour that you have to walk around under the sun?
Under the sun and the rain.
And
or the typhoon sometimes.
And only 2 options, yes, I do. And the others, no, now I know it. They have to choose.
Yeah. So. Any other questions or discussion points? I don't know.
Anyone?
Comments? Has anyone given tours before here?
Probably.
Probably.
Chris, I guess.
Oh, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you looking forward to it? Are you scared?
Yeah, but don't speak all together at once.
Yeah. Please slowly. Why did you guys sign up?
Oh, wait, that sun, why?
All right. Well, that concludes my time.
Basically, I signed up because like we know presentations at school, and that's one thing, but giving a tour is another because you really need to keep the audience engaged. And I said just found out yesterday that talking is probably the easiest thing during a tour because 70% is audience management, and that I think is a big challenge for me. I like to do challenges.
Okay. Well, you're in the right spot for a challenge with a group. Yeah, it's not just about talking. I mean, a lot of like from previous batches of docents, like I remember like a lot of them are like very scared of like, oh, how am I going to remember everything? Or like, how am I going to remember the dates or like the names or like all these things? Like that ultimately doesn't matter. I mean, from my presentation, if you forget the dates, that's totally fine. Most of the time you can find other ways around like the date. But like, I forgot where I was going. Oh yeah, the key thing is to keep the tour moving forward, right? And about not getting stuck. The hardest thing is not memorizing the script. The hardest thing is about like making it entertaining and making it, that's what separates like an average tour guide from like a good tour guide. And the worst thing that could happen is that you forget something. And if you forget something, the audience doesn't know that you forgot. Like they will never know.
Yeah,
they will never know. Like, it doesn't, like, you might think that even if you also explain something maybe not great or you didn't do it as well as the previous time, the visitors don't know. They don't know how you do it other times.
Yeah.
They don't, like...
They don't know about your plan.
Yeah, they don't know what you're missing out. And if you do miss, like, a key point, like, the walking tour is, like, done by several people. So, like, it can, so you can always, like, after the person ends speaking, you can just grab the mic and be like, oh, I would like to add something. And then another person will add in the key point that the other forgot. I mean, usually it's not a big problem, I think, yeah.
Oh, would you like to share your experience in attending other people's walking tour in other countries or organized by other groups?
I mean, I only ever attended tours here. But like here is in Taiwan, and what I find most of the time, actually I attended a tour recently in Spain. I went to like this palace near my hometown, and I realized that the tour guide although it's a very, very small house and it was a 2-hour tour inside a house, she kept it entertaining, and she used a lot of the techniques that I shared here. Like, why did I like it? Because she was active, she kept engaging with the public, she cracked jokes, she asked questions. She would say like, oh, what do you think this is? You know, what do you think that is? How do you feel? You know, she made it very relatable. She also said, oh, I've been giving tours here. I play with the cats in this palace, like the stray cats. And that made me realize she was a really, really good tour guide. My dad went to the same palace like 2 weeks after because I gave such good reviews of the tour, right? And he went and he said it was the most boring thing that he had ever done in his life because it was 2 hours inside this house talking about random stuff that's around the house. And I asked him like, oh, was it this girl with like the curly hair? And he was like, no, it was a man. Like, that makes a huge difference. I loved every moment of it. He hated every moment of it. And my dad loves history. He went in like really looking forward to it, and then he was very disappointed. So it just the house is the same. The items in the house are the same. The content of the tour is probably the same. The only difference is the way that it was presented. And so that's really, really what makes the difference. In Taiwan, I don't think that I have attended like a tour that was horrible. Well, no, actually I have. And it was at this museum. It was that time that they were talking about the ox. The one that I was talking about at the very beginning. This one. This was like a really long time ago, and by one of the volunteers.
We don't know who he is or who she is.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, oh my God, this is dreadful. No, not that those. It was like a Chinese language volunteer.
I know.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I was just thinking, because I already knew the story. Like I already had been. I was like, I'm a tour guide here, but like, it was dreadful. Like, not engaging, and it's not a lot of people also. I want to add, like a lot of the people, especially Taiwanese people who sign up to this docent program, they're very afraid of their English skills, and they're afraid that their English is not good enough. But your English does not have to be fantastic. Like, I have attended good tours in Taiwan with people whose English is not as good as, as a native speaker, obviously, or like who's not that great. Like, of course, you have to be able to communicate with a certain degree of fluency, but we have girls from Taipei, was it Taipei Girls High School, right? They only have like a high school education in English, and they conducted tours perfectly fine. In fact, I think having a limited vocabulary can actually help you make the terms more simple, right? You're not going to try to explain complicated things when you don't have the linguistic ability to explain these complicated things. So actually it makes it easier, but you just need to get over that fear. I see a lot of the time, like the Taiwanese people who are afraid of like speaking English or speaking a foreign language. It's the fear that is holding them back, not the language itself. Like they're just so panicky about it, about memorizing the correct word, that one word that they want to say. But when they loosen up, like it's wonderful, like it's really good. So it's not really about your linguistic ability. That's just another issue. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. I mean, when we first started this walking tour, it was completely different from what it is now. It was, I mean, there were some parts that we straight up cut out of the tour that we don't talk about anymore.
I have shared with them.
Yeah, and so it only gets better, and the more you do it, I mean, I don't remember how my first walking tour was.
Yeah.
It was probably not great, but
it's good.
Yeah, like it's fine, but it's like
better and better each time. Yeah.
Because each time you do it, you think of ways that could be better, like how it can be improved.
And I have shared with them that our walking tour starts from a Chinese tour by an expert, but we have also talked about how in a certain time you can actually convey more things in Chinese than in English.
Mm-hmm.
So a 2-hour Chinese tour, if you wanted to, say it in English, then it's going to be 4 hours long. If you wanted to say everything.
Yeah.
And
because you would need a lot of background knowledge.
And also background knowledge. So you really don't have to cram up with the information, although our tour is quite informative.
It is very
comparing
informative.
with other tours.
Yeah. I mean, I think our tour is pretty intense. I don't want to say that it's like the best tour in Taiwan, but I think it is the best tour in Taiwan. Because it covers a lot of information, and it's like, but it's still entertaining.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it always depends on the guide, but I feel like most of the people who come, like they really do love it, and like the feedback that they give you at the end, like is wonderful. Sometimes, like I love it when Taiwanese people come to the tour and they're like, I loved it. I learned so much about Taipei, or about Taiwan, and like, you know, it's a foreigner telling you these things, and like they find it very funny, and I find it kind of funny as well. But you know, it's like the whole point is that like we're talking about things that are not on your history textbooks, and we're talking about things that are not like general knowledge. That's the whole idea. And so it's wonderful to get great feedback from Taiwanese people, especially. Yeah. What time does this end at midday? 12, right?
Yeah. It's so, any last
opportunity? The site is very quiet. It's okay.
Yeah, because they all have a tentative. Okay.
I was wondering how, kind of like how you manage the pace of the tour.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're starting out. You don't want to go too slow so it's going forward.
Yeah.
Not too fast if they're like not catching the information.
Yeah, and well, you mean the speed of your voice, or just?
Like the pace of the tour, like moving, moving on to.
Yeah. So, I mean, this comes with just experience, right? Like, but for the first tours especially, I would prepare to talk about a lot more things than I will actually talk. So I would prepare, say, if you're doing a 20-minute tour, right? A 20-minute tour maybe only allows you to talk about 3 different locations. But I would prepare 5, right? Just in case I need to add something extra, right? Like you just have it, and then if you end early, then you can add that piece. And then the other way around, like if you're talking about 3 locations and then in the end you only talk about 2, the audience won't know. They won't know. So it's totally fine. You just have to find a way to, you know, to figure out like what's the best way, right? Like also it's not just about the talking speed, it's also about walking speed, you know, like the size of the group really greatly influences how long it takes to go from one spot to the other. So in our walking tours, if we have like a really large group, we might have to talk less simply because we're taking way more time to go from Beimen to Guanqianlu, right? Like we spending like 20 minutes walking like this stretch of road. So we just have to cut things. You just have to always be ready for both scenarios, like that you're too fast or too slow, or that you're speaking too fast. Like you also, I mean, if you are more concerned about your voice and the speed of your talk, you just have to realize, like, if you're trying to catch your breath, if you're out of breath during the talk, then maybe you're speaking too fast. So you have to, you know, be conscious, be like, okay, I need to calm down and like. And I think it's better to be a little bit slower than to be a little bit fast, because a lot of the people who attend the tour are not native speakers of English. I mean, not just because they're Taiwanese, but because the whole world doesn't speak English. Like French people don't speak English, right? So you know, it's better to be slow and to have more simple vocab than to be like fast and have complicated vocab. Yeah. I think that's all. Yeah. So thank you very much, and that's all for today. Hope to see you at the next tour.
And also special thanks to our staff over here for the live broadcasting systems, and also the lunch boxes and all the supports.
Thank you. 谢谢. And to all the people watching from home.